Our next speaker is Jerónimo Pizarro. Jerónimo, well, I should have said this at the start. Of course, both Simone Celani and Jerónimo Pizarro, they don't need to be introduced. So I'm being unnecessary here as the channel of news regarding these two fellow colleagues. But still playing my role, he's professor at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, where he holds the Camões Institute Chair in Portuguese Studies. He holds a PhD in Hispanic Literatures from Harvard University, and also a PhD in Portuguese Linguistics from the University of Lisbon. Currently, he's in charge of Tinta das Chinas Coleção Pessoa. And Jerónimo, that's it?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be in this city, to be part of this project, to be in this table, in Parma, in the university, so thank you so much. I have some collection of notes. I've been working until the last minutes and thinking about all these materials pertaining to the Duke of Parma. I'll go very fast. I have many slides. I was making like a joke about a missing title because more than 10 years ago we invited João Dionísio to write on Duke of Parma, and at that time we didn't have enough material, and he wrote about a notebook by Alexander Serge, but he thought at the time it was very difficult to write about Duke of Parma. We were missing information and materials. So in a way, I'm very happy he is now here and thinking about Duke of Parma. I want to dedicate this presentation to Carlos Pittella. I think his work is a pioneering work. And I was looking at some of my emails, and it was in July 2014 that he suggested a postdoc. It was very difficult to find someone in the Facultad de Letras to accept his postdoc, but that's a different story. And he was already thinking almost 10 years ago in working with a non-static theater of Fernando Pessoa. And at that time, in 2014, he was planning to edit Duke of Parma, Prometheus Revinctus, we still have to do that, and Marino, and Fausto. So of his 4 dreams, he already completed 2, Fausto and Marino. And I hope we can now edit the Duke of Parma, and I guess Enrico will have to continue if we can with Prometheus Revinctus. So that's what happened in 2014. It was like the initial plan. I will talk about editorial challenges in a way, more about chronology. I will jump about proyectos, lists, because we already talked about that. But it's true that at least according to Richard Zenit, but I do not agree entirely. Well, I mean, we have this first list from 1909, so we might think that it was from here that the Duke began. But as João Dionísio explained, I mean, there is history before and a history after any plan, and this is just one moment in 1909 when it's more simple to establish a list of English works, but it's not necessarily the pure, real beginning of the work. Teresa Felipe showed also this image, as I told you. This is like ChatGPT or something similar. There are some datable, I mean, there are like 10 or 15 lists, and we have seen many of these in Marino, a Tragedy, Datable Fragments and List. Carlos Pittella presented many of those. And what is interesting is that if we have this one from 1909, then we have a group of 1913, 1913, 14. It's like the nucleus of the first phase. And then we jump almost to 1920, 25, 30. Most of these lists were translated by Carlos Pitela in the Fausto, the Portuguese edition. And we have more or less 10 to 15 lists. And we know that the project, like Fausto, took most of the productive years of Pessoa's life. This is the last one, like the Terminus ad Chem. We already saw this, and it was also in Dionys's presentation. The horror. Well, but let's move to editorial challenges. I want to go back to something that João Dionísio has presented in his edition of Alexander's Search, critical edition for Imprensa Nacional Casa da Moeda, and I will explain you why. I mean, we know that Pessoa drafted a letter to William Butler Yeats, and we know he had like in the radar, in his mind, a set of English, British, Irish critics, the most important at the moment. Here you can read maybe Sainsbury, Dowden, Edmund Goose, Stoneford Brooke, Sir Walter Raleigh, Yeats, and Watts Dunton. So I know this is going to be like in connection to your presentation. This is a fantastic piece where you have some of those names, maybe 1914, and then in a very stylish letter, and with the circumflex on Pessoa, so it's before September 1916 when he took away the circumflex from the O. This might be 1 or 2 years before, and he's thinking of sending some English poems to these critics and a letter to William Butler Yeats, and I think he was planning to ask information about the Irish literary theatre to Yeats. So this is for me like a front cover for the Duke of Parma, with beautiful signatures and presentations of the title and the author. And we know, if we cross some information, we know not only that Pessoa was planning to send some poems to these critics, and only poems, but we know more or less which poems he was planning to send. At least we have a list of 6 or 7. These poems are 2 from the Mad Fiddler, 2 from 35 sonnets, 2 or 3 unpublished poems that we discover after 1935. So when he was planning to send poems to some English critics, he did not have in mind a book. There was not yet, it was not 1918. He did not have Antinous. He did not have yet the Mad Fiddler. There was not, maybe there was not the final group of the 35 sonnets, but he had different poems that were going to pertain to different books, and he was planning to send those poems to the most renowned critics of the time. At least for Pessoa, Sainsbury was professor in Edinburgh, and Pessoa has in his library poems by John Donne with an introduction by Sainsbury. We were talking about Ibsen, and Edmund Gosse was the translator of Ibsen. So, and he read from him some poems, and maybe for Pessoa, more than a critic, he was a poet. Then he was in Cambridge, so he was thinking someone in Edinburgh, someone in Cambridge. Alexander Raleigh was professor of English literature in Oxford. And Pessoa was interested in some of his books and in the same authors, Milton, Wordsworth, Shakespeare. Theodore Wadsworth, he was really old at the time. He will die in 1914. So if he is in this kind of lists, maybe it's because the lists were written in 1913, 1914, before he died. And in any case, he is related to some things that we already talked, because he was a friend of Rossetti, of Swinburne, of Tennyson, etc. He also contemplated other names like Arthur Keeler Couch, and he has in his personal library the Oxford Book of the Victorian Verse. He thought of Edward Dowden because he had the life of Percy B. Shelley, and he thought of Stamford Brooke, and he had the second edition of Theology in the English Poets, Cooper, Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Burns. So Pessoa was very clear-minded about who he was planning to write. Maybe these or some of these plans already from 19. I'm sure some of the initial plan was in 1913, and then in 17 he was still with the idea, when the Mad Fiddler was almost finished, of sending to the same critics and now to some Portuguese people a book and not only some poems. For me, there is a strong relationship of all this I'm presenting with Il violinista pazzo in Italiano, because some of the poems that Pessoa was planning to send to some British critics, English critics, were included afterwards in The Mad Fiddler. That's why I've been defending, in a way, today, that we have to go back to the work of Anne Terlinden and other works where the Mad Fiddler was studied, and to some unpublished documents at the time. She defended the dissertation in 1984 and published as a book in 1990. Because some documents that we saw today, or that we didn't, we saw the one on the right, but for example, the one on the left, it says, the Mad Fiddler concentrates the inferior and childish work of my undisciplined inspiration. He was critic, but this was written more or less in the same years that the Duke of Parma, at least in part. I was also mentioning, but I don't know if he's Italian or not, Marco Sangioni. We know Fernando Gomez is Portuguese, but they published The Mad Fiddler in a critical edition, one of the 3 volumes of the English poetry by Pessoa, published by the Imprensa Nacional. And we also have this list, maybe about the English poems that Pessoa did publish between 1918 and 21. There are other names of other critics that did not repeat before, but Pessoa was very, very concerned about sending his writings to some English critics. And this is very interesting, and we saw this list because this belongs to an editorial, a publishing house, an editorial project by Pessoa called Olisipo, and belonging to Olisipo was the plan of publishing the Duke of Parma. Now, let me go back to Memoranda. Memoranda is very similar to what João Dionísio presented, or his conception of lists and different projects. In a way, Memoranda and lists are very similar. This is a lovely memoranda from 1913 by Pessoa with many, many plans in his head. So, translating The Tempest and many other works by Shakespeare, translating The First Principles by Spencer, and writing to some of these English critics that we already talked about. And then he continues, this is wonderful, this is Pessoa, familiar to me. I write in both, though I have only published and only very little in the less European known one. For my Portuguese work, I can, however, find critics, though I'm persuaded I'm the best one. In reference, however, to my English work, do not see why I should not avail myself of the circumstance that competent critics exist to inflict upon the request I'm making you undergo. So he was only unsure, or he was only trying to find critics for his English work, not for the Portuguese, at least according to this letter. And then in the third draft, there would be no more to say were there not an observation to formake. You will notice perhaps that there is certain Elizabethanism in all these poems. And you will be inclined to that they have been painted Elizabethan, not that their color is of the color of Elizabethan sentiments and ideas, so that any Portuguese who knows the soul of English will lapse into Elizabethanism of a style spontaneously, sincerely, and even self-surprisingly. He was very, very conscious of what he was doing, and he knew what critics might say, and maybe only Wat Staunton could read better what he was writing, not exactly the translator of Ibsen or others. So this is what we were saying exactly about Allard Nicol and the history of English drama in relation to his opinions of the deadhead of Elizabethanism. And then we talk about Archer and the presence of some critics of this anachronistic way of writing at the time of Pessoa. So let me move to the materials of the Duke of Parma after this long introduction. I think we have to make many relationships. This is why I was making I was talking to Teresa indirectly about this book yesterday, because we will find not only text about this tragedy or drama or whatever it is, we will also find notes that pertain not to the Duke but are in the same sheets of paper. So, for example, this is a note of supernatural religion, quoting from Trench in this book. And Pessoa was reading about miracles, and he was taking notes. And for example, this is the book of his library, signed by Alexander Serge. Alexander Serge is very, very present in the beginning, in the first years of the Duke of Parma. Some of the books of Pessoa's personal library have the signature of Alexander Serge, and Pessoa Serge was reading about miracles, and he was taking notes as this one. Not every maybe great act is of course limited, but a miracle has infinity in itself as altering the order of nature, and we will find this at the back of one of the papers. Then we find this Dramatis Personae list presented by Teresa, but what I find fascinating is the address. Rua da Bela Vista, Lapa, 17, because we have many documents with this address. Pessoa was there between 1907 and 1909. It was the address of Pessoa and Alexander Serge. And I mean, this could have been used not exactly in that period of time, but maybe more or less it was. And I think we can follow some hints to imagine that the Duke of Parma began to be drafted maybe 1907, 1908 as Faust. So not 1909, but maybe before. We have papers like this one and others where we have the name of Alexander Serge and the plan for books by Alexander Serge, like Delirium. And when we studied in the paper that Nicolás Barbosa presented on Portugal, some of these papers in dialogue with the work of João Dionísio, when some poems by Serge were written again in a clearly fashion, we think that that happened between 1909 and 1910. So the period of time that we might have Alexander Serge at the back of certain papers of the Duke of Parma, I think it's from the period of 1907 to 1909, 1910. We also see Pessoa reading Camilo Castelo Branco, but to get information about José Anastácio da Cunha, an author he was very interested in, especially in 1909, 1910, when he had a publishing house called Ibis. And he was reading these Noites de Insomnia, and at least 3 of the volumes of this 1874 work by Camilo Castelo Branco. We find papers as this one of Mario Nogueira de Freitas, where Pessoa worked, and a different address, but that I guess that we can defend, and we have to study this more, that some of the papers with that address where Pessoa worked belong to 1909, and we can more or less reconstruct what he was reading and doing at that period of time. I still have to study this paper much more, because I think that if I find the other half, and I think I already saw it, I don't know exactly where, I think it's a note with the name of Alexander Serge, or I think I will find the second part with his name. And then we have notes that I don't know where are we going to place, very strange notes. If this is, I mean, I don't know if Duke of Parma, if the first 3 lines belong to the Duke of Parma, maybe or not. It says, if the word were the settlers, even the blind were forced to blinkers. Duke of Parma, maybe, but like a note without a context. Then we have this Agencia Mineira Anglo-Portuguesa, and we have many papers of the discussion between Bacon, Shakespeare. Pessoa was very, very interested. He read a lot about if the work of Shakespeare was Shakespearean or Baconian. He left many, many drafts about that subject, like 200 pages. And when he was writing about Shakespeare, Bacon, he was using the same type of paper, and we can relate some of these considerations about the attribution of the anonymous work by Shakespeare to a certain materiality, with this idea that we were discussing of a network based on material aspects. We have this kind of paper we are very used to finding Pessoa's archive of proposal for mortgage. And we have lines by Alberto, by the Duke, and this might be 1913. I think that's just like a guess, that a first complete conception or kind of draft of the Duke of Parma existed already in 1913, when Pessoa was already planning to write to the English critics about some of his English poems. And I think that we have to make a relationship between when Pessoa was writing more English poems, that is between 1910 and 1912, and the Duke of Parma, because I think that in the same years that Pessoa was very intense with English poetry, he was very intense with the Duke of Parma. There are some papers that were simply used many, many years afterwards, because Upalrador was a fictitious magazine created by Pessoa when he was 14 years old. but he kept some of those papers, and there is at least a monologue by Alberto. And this, we were discussing this with Teresa, this we think might be one of the oldest manuscripts we have of the Duke of Parma, at least at this point, because this is a notebook that began to be filled up in 1906. Maybe some notes are of 1907, and then you have these Laertes change for Duke, and this might be a small 2 or 3 lines by the Duke already in 1906, 1907 in one of the notebooks. On one side, Marino, on the other side, Duke of Parma. That means that the work of Carlo Pitella with Marino is going to be fundamental to study Duke, because they were contemporary for certain years. Well, let me continue with other documents. I'm fascinated because Pessoa will normally use a big envelope to keep some of his papers. And in this paper, we can read The Conquest of Granada. And The Conquest of Granada is a work by Dryden. And Pessoa did translate to Portuguese, and this was published, some of The Conquest of Granada by Dryden, and he was interested in that. So we find in the papers of the Duke of Parma little points of connection with other dramas, with other English dramas, and with his multiple interest and knowledge of certain dramatists. We have something only about going to cut his beard and to catalog some games and go to the typography and very simple notes of life. And I think this has a relationship with something that we were looking with Enrico, and that it's quoted in the 2021 biography. The plan to write a preface to the Duke of Parma might be from 1911 or 1913, from those years. So, I mean, if Pessoa was already planning a preface, I guess it's possible that at least around 1913, he already had like a mentally complete image of the Duke of Parma. We have some notes at the back of other papers where he mentions the Kaiser, the German Kaiser, and he will always, and in a very paradoxical way, where he talks about France and Italy, but then he talks about Germany, and he just says, well, the Kaiser never made any harm to me. And that might be from 1916, more or less. The Kaiser will die in 1918. We have some automatic writings, and that might also point to 1916, 1917. We have this address of that we have found many times. João Dionísio, when he was working with poems from 1915 to 1920, I found many times this kind of paper with this mark when I was working in the Book of Disquiet, and most of the papers from Rua do Ouro 87, not all of them, but most of them are from 1918. And then we have only like 3 or 4 of the papers of Duke of Parma where we can find a date. One from 1918, Duke, from furthest youth have I been different from all that men are natural, and the difference that Duke has because he was insane from other men. We have this paper from 1919 at least, part of a letter. We have another dated manuscript of the Duke of Parma from 1922. We have a material of a printed poster from 1922 used afterwards. And we have this fantastic paper from the last year of Pessoa's life, 1935, the beginning of 1935, from the 4th January 1935, where the devil appears. And I think it's the same devil that you were presenting, and I think it's the same devil we have in the Devil's Hour, because the Devil's Hour is from 1913. It was a big mistake by Teresa Rita Lopez, considering it was from 1913 or 1914. It's from the last year of life of Pessoa. So, and then we have, well, all these other challenges that we also see already, the Duke of Parma with some certain doubts. There is a page where Pessoa was planning to make a selection, and we will have to discuss if we want or not to make some kind of selection at a certain point. But Pessoa did keep all these documents. He was he never did the selection, but he did plan making one. And this devil that we saw before, I think is the same devil of the Devil's Hour, Duke of Parma in 1913, and this is the last slide. So thank God for the devil. Thank you for being here, and thank to the Duke of Parma for bringing this to happen. Thank you so much.
Okay. So, thank you so much, Jerónimo, for this tour around very many materials associated with the Duke. Now we can treat him in a somewhat familiar way. Well, the floor is yours. So, questions, remarks. I think that perhaps we could extend the one-day colloquium to one day and the morning of the following day, so that we can discuss this duly. But Teresa, Carlotta, our host, Professor Saglia. No? Well, I have some questions. I think that there is a huge difference between the hymns of hope we heard during the morning and these two last papers. Because during the morning, and actually immediately after our lunch, we were all excited with what would be done by Enrico's team. And we had this idea that it was feasible. They would do it, okay? A marvelous team, a set of very shrewd transcribers, consultants, the possibility of cooperation with the digital lab led by Professoressa Raboni. The sun shone bright, okay? And then when we were about to celebrate this magnificent one-day colloquium, we start listening to Simone Cellani, who says, okay, Professor Martinez pointed out two of the main features of this edition, but there is one remaining feature, and that is this should be open. And when he starts explaining what open means, this brings the bar up. But my question is, does it bring up so that it still can be seen, or isn't it an obstacle? That, I mean, I'm copy-pasting from your paper. You said, this is the start of things, so we can aim high. So let's be optimistic. Is that being optimistic, or is that the closest detour we have to doom? That is my question to you. Now I had some expectations about the return of the hope mood with Jerónimo's paper. And what he says is, okay, basically everything is taken for granted. The project has not yet started, and he starts going, now Prometheus Revinctus. Okay, Enrico, deal with that as well. And we had this naive idea that the project would be focused on the transcription of the documents associated with the Duke of Parma. And what this guy does is, okay, let's turn the document around to see what is there. And start looking sideways. And so, okay, it is the Duke. But actually, it is the correspondence with critics. Then it is the connection with Alexander Serge. Then it is the connection with the readings supposedly made by Alexander Serge. Then it is the papers related with mortgages, and etc. And suddenly, you two meet. Because what he was saying is totally compatible with your idea of the Duke. You don't have an idea about the Duke, you have an idea about the whole archive by Pessoa, okay? And so I think this is high time we bring our expectations to earth and see what is really feasible, because if these are your aims, I should tell you from the start, those are your aims, but not my aim at all.
For the second time.
Okay. And also there's that the sheer terror of someone who chairs a session with Jerónimo, who thinks, okay, let's talk about the future, and he brings a piece of communication I didn't remember at all, and said, oh, I invited you to do this and you didn't. Okay, I mean, not very civil, but so these are my questions. How realistic is what you are suggesting? Okay, and thank you.
Yeah. I have a question for you. What is wider, the universe with his galaxies, stars, planets, and so on, or the Pessoa archive?
Pessoa archive.
Well, then, I think no, it's not as so. But
And I will make a disclaimer.
they're comparable, I think. Okay. We have Stephen Hawking said that we can, I don't know when, encounter this discovery all theory of the universe. Then we can do this too, I think. So
And a disclaimer, I did discourage Enrico for many months, but it was impossible, so I could not discourage him, and in a way it's his fault, but we are very happy about that.
No, I mean, as a piece of evidence, and of course I'm biased, we all are, but I must say I'm biased. No, yeah, Simone, please.
Without trick, I think that it's not a problem of hand a project of this big thing. I think that it's the thing is to construct a dialogue instrument and to put in the edition these open doors for present and future editions to dialogue. Because my opinion is that we have a big diversity, big disorganization about all of this material that we have constructed in these years, in these decades. But I think that the problem is not to construct others' objects, is to see all and understand how what they say in general, what they say in. And the other thing is that the writing construct of Pessoa was the daily writing. Let's say I want to say is that if in July 12, 1922, he writes, the book is quite a fragment, then a fragment first, then there is a line of reading, a possibility of reading that I want to see. And for me, it's not most important, but important almost like to read. I want to see this.
I understand that. I shall put this very simply, and so I acknowledge this is an oversimplification of what you said, but there are two challenges, so to say, thinking about Enrico's project. One, either you consider that from the start, and so you have to transcribe in such a way that a platform will be built already at the beginning of the project in order to accommodate those possibilities, namely with the use of a patterned science information language that will enable the connections with other platforms. And this amounts to say the following. We all agree that we love humanity, okay? But when you start speaking about how shall we enact our love for humanity, we start discussing because I'm more conservative, he's an anarchist, and you are a socialist. And so our different approaches will translate into different approaches to what we are trying to do. So we have to distinguish between an overall goal and how to get close to it. Or else they'll do the work, and afterwards they'll start thinking about it. The problem is that when they reach the conclusion, they have already closed some doors that you would like them to open at the beginning. And so it has a huge influence in the way that everything is designed, okay? I recall a piece of conversation I had with a fellow linguist working in, I don't remember which university, and I was really worried about the use of TEI, Text Encoding Initiative, XML language. And he realized that I was really worried. And he patted me and said, well, don't worry, you do your job. By the minute you finish your job, it might be that XML language that we'll be using, or any other language, because the thing is we have to build something that will translate whatever you do. So to what extent is this a prior aim or a second or third? I don't know. Okay, so I'm sharing my notes with you.
And then I agree we are working for the digital, but we might also work for paper. In the case of Fausto, there is a proposal for the paper edition and a different proposal for the digital edition, and we might work in more than one editorial proposal. So that's just one more problem. And Pessoa is a special case. How many biographies do we have on Pessoa? More than 6, 10, and I don't know any other author. He died only in 1935, and we already have 6 big biographies and many other small biographies. So I think there is like obsession on Pessoa, and I think that some of these works are going to be published many times. So for us, it's like we are beginning, but maybe in some years we will have 4 or 5 different editions of the Duke of Parma.
Oh, please. Okay, but I'm sorry I have somewhat encumbered your patience with this dialogue, but really questions and remarks I should keep
and we
silent.
are waiting for a new edition of Alexander Serge poems by Joe Dionisio.
Of course you are. Keep waiting. Of course you are. Come on, we cannot end on this note.
Simone, in the last slide you showed, the Duke of Parma. In the last slide you showed, the Duke of Parma was in the middle. Was it on purpose? Because I'm already frightened.
Captatio benevolentia. No, it's the idea of the hub.
Okay,
A
so
graphic.
okay, thank you.
Just to bridge before Professor Saglia takes his word, just to bridge the two papers, they had everything set up beforehand, okay? Because he is an old adept of synchronicity. So this happened at the same time that this happened. This happened at the same time that this happened. He's playing the drums. And then the guy with the keyboard goes on and says, yes, synchronicity. On the other side of the paper, this happens and that happens, etc. And so, and we are caught in between. Not a very good picture. But
DJ.
Please, Professor Saglia.
You're absolutely right. They're a double act, aren't they? You know, like you're on the stage and then you play things off one another. And that's exactly it's not really a question, but it's a reflection, or maybe it's a provocation for some more remarks. When Professor Celani was talking about, and Simone was talking about opening doors, and interconnectedness, I was thinking to myself, well, that's fine, because he means connections, links to other aspects of the archive or his production, or maybe it all stays within sort of the Portuguese dimension. But then, of course, Professor Pizarro, Jerónimo, begins to open things up even further, and this slew of late Victorian, early 20th century British professors and critics and people like that comes in. And so I thought, oh God, here we go. And at the beginning, when we were talking about the English connections, it was only Shakespeare. Then I start talking about all of those Elizabethan, neo-Elizabethan things, and then Teresa brings up Oscar Wilde, and now we have this roll call of all the great figures of the literary establishment of the time, which is both slightly frightening, like everything else that this last session has been talking about, but also extremely exciting. So there might be really quite some mileage in looking at these figures, what he might have read about them, which sort of ideas they had of poetry, of drama, of what needed to be done in present times, what kind of literary discourse they were promoting. But what is fascinating again is that most of them were, at least the names I recognized, in extremely authoritative positions. They were not the trend setters of the new. Some of them, like Theodore Watts Dunton, like really the last generation, but most of them, they really supported, some of them were poets, Arthur Quiller Couch, the great Shakespearean scholar, George Sainsbury, basically the sort of encyclopedic author of the history of English literature, history of English prosody, this and that and the other. So the great systematizer of the time. He really wanted to talk to this kind of world. Then Yeats was interesting, however, because he was a transitional figure between Ireland and England, trying to, playing it both ways at a certain time, and then sort of identifying a lot more with Irish national culture. So again, a kind of transitive in-between figure that Pessoa might have felt related to in some way. But definitely he was going for the great people, the people who could actually give him a stamp of approval. And oh my goodness, it's scary.
And he did the same, and it was a mistake in 1915 when he wrote Miguel de Unamuno. And Unamuno did not reply, but when he thought of someone in Spain, and I think that was a mistake, he did not think in the ultraísta as well. That's afterwards. He did not think in Ramón Gómez de la Serna or in someone young. He sent his magazine in 1915 to Unamuno. So he was looking for that kind of figure, but in the English world.
Well, thank you. Coming back to synchronicity, a fairly good example. When Jerónimo showed us that piece of paper with a reference to the Kaiser, we all know who the Kaiser was, and we know that the Kaiser died in 1918, right?
Yes.
So that gives us a good starting point to ascribe a given chronology. But take the example of Theodore Watts Dunton, okay? He died in 1914.
Yes.
Did Pessoa know that he had died in 1914?
I think because he wrote an interrogation after
When?
his name.
But when
So
did
he
do
was
it?
I think in 1914, and he was unsure if he was still alive. But
I can imagine this marvelous web of connected references that actuate. Maybe this happened this time, and at the same time, maybe this happened that time. And it is two maybes too many.
yeah, but in the last days we have been discussing how many fiction can a biography handle.
No, of course. No, and there's another thing, Jerónimo, and of course I'm speaking seriously. We, and I'm part of the group, of course, we have been keen on dating texts according to termini quo, and we have to look at terminus ad quem. And that in itself would deserve a workshop because one of the things is what I did 23 years ago, and you 10 years ago, and you yesterday. But now we can go back to some of the dates that have been ascribed editorially to some of those texts, and the state of the art is not the same. So the status questionis is different, and we can somewhat revise some of the dates that have been not. It is not only the case of Teresa Rita Lopes, of course.
Yeah.
There are very many, and that would produce results. But at the same time, I think that the overall result would still be too vulnerable to be the basis for something as ambitious as
Yes.
something fully based on synchronicity.
Yeah, yes. I agree.
No, but we had a marvelous intervention, really, and then we go back to depression. I'm sorry.
Whose fault is
Thank
I stand
God for the
corrected.
devil. Thank God for the devil.
No, I think this is high time to thank our marvelous speakers and to ask our host to come to the floor.
I would like to thank all my colleagues. As you said, I should be scared now at this moment, but you also said that I'm a fool, so I'm still more excited than I was this morning. I think this conference proved that even if we don't know much about the Duke of Parma yet, this sort of multifaceted approach to the text from different perspectives really created today a platform from which we can begin, we can start our journey, knowing that there are many paths to be followed, many doors to be opened, but after all, Fernando Pessoa could only take us into a labyrinth. So that was to be expected. Thank you. Thank you.